Every historical novel begins with a question. Mine began with names. Names I had heard long before I ever thought of writing a novel. Some were spoken at family gatherings. Some appeared on old records. Some belonged to mountains, gaps, cemeteries, and communities I had known most of my life. And behind those names were stories, and ordinary people caught between forces far larger than themselves. Eventually, I began asking a different question. What would happen if all those fragments were brought together? Not as a history book, as a story. A story about what it might actually have felt like to live through the Civil War in these mountains. That became The Blue Ridge Between Us. This is Echoes of the Blue Ridge. I'm author and realtor Ryan Phillips. This episode is different. Normally on Echoes of the Blue Ridge, we take one place, one person, one legend, or one forgotten moment from the mountains and follow it wherever the historical trail leads. Today we're going behind the story, because The Blue Ridge Between Us is historical fiction. But underneath the fiction is something very real. The people, the families, the places, and many of the events. That distinction mattered enough to me that I put it at the beginning of the book. The novel tells the reader that this is historical fiction inspired by real people and events, with some events and characterizations imagined to bring the narrative together. And in the introduction, I explain it another way. The story is rooted in real people, real places, and real events from the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Civil War. The roads, mountains, loyalties, and divisions are real. That is the foundation of the novel. And perhaps the best place to begin is with the man at its center. Fidel Phillips was real. He was my great-great-grandfather. And the strange thing about Fidel is that the family stories surrounding him were never quite fit neatly into the official record. Family tradition remembered him as something resembling a young spy during the Civil War. He was a rider. He was quick, clever, and somehow involved in a war in which, according to the records we have, he was never formally conscripted into Confederate service. Yet decades later, Fidel identified himself as a Confederate veteran in the 1910 census. That contradiction fascinated me, because somewhere between those two facts was a missing story. What exactly had this young man done? Who had trusted him? What had he seen? What roads had he ridden? And what if the reason we couldn't find his military record was because the work he performed was never supposed to appear on one? That is where historical fiction enters. I took what my family remembered and placed Fidel into the documented world surrounding him. In the novel, he becomes the Gray Fox, a young rider trusted to carry intelligence and coded messages through the mountains. Not a battlefield hero, a messenger. A boy who could pass through places where an armed soldier might immediately draw suspicion. The novel eventually defines his role very simply. He becomes a rider between danger and response, someone who might learn what is coming early enough to warn others. That part is imagined, but the world through which Fidel rides was not. One of the earliest historical events woven into the novel takes place in Marshall as North Carolina moved toward secession. The actual story is complicated. There was violence associated with the political turmoil surrounding secession. Sheriff Ransom Merrill shot Elijah Tweed, the son of Neely Tweed. Elijah survived. Later that evening, Neely Tweed found Merrill in Marshall and killed him with a double-barreled shotgun. For the novel, I compressed and altered the sequence. I placed Fidel, Hiram, and Reuben there and allowed young Fidel to witness violence erupt directly before him. In the manuscript, Merrill shoots Elijah Tweed and the crowd breaks apart in confusion. That is historical fiction doing what historical fiction can do. The underlying event is real. The emotional experience is constructed. I wanted the reader beside Fidel when politics stopped being speeches and became blood. Because that happened throughout these mountains. People had argued about union and secession. Then suddenly somebody was dead, and everything changed. Then there is Josiah Sams, another real man, another ancestor, and one of my favorite figures in the story. Josiah belonged to the early history of Mars Hill College. His family helped establish the school, and during the war years, when survival of the institution was anything but certain, he contributed money to help keep it alive. But another family story followed Josiah. He was hanged by the raiders and survived. He carried terrible scars around his neck for the remainder of his life. That happened. The novel takes that fact and asks the question history cannot answer. What was it like? Who stood nearby? What did his daughter see? What did Fidel do? What did Josiah think when the rope tightened? Those answers are fiction, but the scar was real. That distinction runs throughout the book. History gives us the scar. Then the story reaches one of the darkest chapters in Madison County history, Shelton Laurel, January 1863. 13 prisoners, including older men and boys, were taken into the winter countryside and executed without trial. That massacre is real, and I knew from the beginning that I could not write a Civil War novel centered in Madison County without confronting it. Because Shelton Laurel did not disappear when the bodies were buried. People argued over responsibility almost immediately. They have been arguing about it ever since. James Keith became permanently associated with the massacre. The novel does not attempt to erase that association, but adds in another possibility. What if someone else actually gave the order to kill? That is my fictional interpretation of a historical catastrophe. And I included Shelton Laurel because you cannot understand the Civil War in these mountains by looking only at armies. The war entered homes, it entered families, and sometimes the worst violence came from men who lived only a few ridges apart. Then there was the Battle of Red Banks, or what later became remembered as the Battle of Bloody Chucky by the surviving Confederates. Another real event, and one I wanted in the book because stripped of mythology, it represents one of those extraordinary moments when confusion, command failures, local knowledge, and bad decisions collide. James Keith and the mountain war surrounding him became central to this portion of the novel. Fidel tries to carry warnings. Information moves through mountain roads. Men make decisions without knowing what the next ridge holds. And then people die. After Red Banks, he understands something important. He can carry information. He can warn people. He can sometimes change what happens, but he cannot control war. That realization became important to me, because I didn't want The Blue Ridge Between Us to be a story where one fictional hero secretly determines history. Fidel doesn't control history, he survives it. Other names appear throughout the story because they belong to my family as well. Alan Buckner, William Murray, real men who served during the war. Alan Buckner became especially fascinating to me because family history remembers him making and using his own rifle, and he lived an extraordinary life. He survived the Civil War and eventually reached 102 years old. The place where he lived became known as Buckner Gap. William Murray was another real ancestor. He supported Mars Hill College and helped construct the first building. His family became associated with Murray Mountain. The manuscript places Buckner and Murray in the final desperate stages of the war, remnants of units that had been broken, captured, reorganized, and depleted. Again, the characters are not names invented for the novel. They belonged here. And then there is Joel Holcombe, another ancestor, another real man, and another reminder that the Civil War in western North Carolina did not simply end when Confederate armies surrendered. Holcombe was associated with the Home Guard around Mars Hill College. His name became tangled in the bitterness surrounding Shelton Laurel. After the war, Joe Shelton killed him in his own yard. Revenge. But war had technically ended, but the killing had not. That mattered deeply to the novel because I wanted the final chapters to ask a question most Civil War stories avoid. What happens when everybody comes home? What happens when the man who fought against your family lives half a mile away? What happens when the person you blame for your brother's death appears at the same store? What happens when the children from opposing families eventually marry? that is where the title begins to mean something different. The Blue Ridge divided people, but it also connected them. A ridge could separate communities. A mountain pass could join them. North Carolina and Tennessee were divided by a state line, but families crossed that line constantly. Fidel eventually settled around Flag Pond, Tennessee. Mary Liz Sams became his wife. Old enemies became neighbors. Families intertwined. Children inherited names without always inheriting the hatred attached to them. One passage in the novel describes how the county slowly began knitting itself together again. Not through speeches, through marriage, children, work, borrowed tools, shared roads, family visits, ordinary life. People simply kept living near one another after history had done its worst. That may be the most important idea in the entire book, because The Blue Ridge Between Us isn't really a book about who won the Civil War. It's about what remained afterward. There's another person behind this book who never appears as a character. My father, James Robert Phillips. I dedicated the novel to him. He descended directly from many of the people whose lives shaped this story. He carried their names and stories forward. Some of the earliest conversations that eventually became this novel were conversations between the two of us. We talked about what had been handed down, and just as importantly, we wondered about the things nobody could explain anymore. That stayed with me, because family history rarely arrives complete. You inherit pieces, a name, photograph, grave, a story your grandfather heard from his grandfather, a strange sentence in a census record, a scar nobody completely explained, and then one generation has to decide whether those fragments disappear or whether somebody picks them up. For me, writing this book was a way of picking them up. So when someone asks me how much of The Blue Ridge Between Us is true, my answer is more than you might think. The people and families were real. The places were real. The divided loyalties were real. The fear was very real. And the consequences lasted long after the armies left. What I created were the conversations history did not record, the private moments, the connections, some motivations, and Fidel's secret life as the Gray Fox. That is why the author's note says the book is not intended to replace history, but to stand beside it, taking what survived in memory and imagining the portions that were never completely told. There is a photograph in a family album, a name in a cemetery, a mountain carrying someone's surname, and somewhere between all of them is a human life. That's what interested me, not simply what Fidel did, but what he feared, who he loved, what he remembered when he became an old man, what Josiah thought when he looked at his daughter, what happened when men who had spent years trying to survive finally had to learn how to live again. We will never know all of those things. History doesn't give us everything. Maybe that's why I wrote the novel. Not to change the history, not to claim that every scene happened exactly as I've written it, but to walk those old roads again and ask what might have happened in the spaces where the records fell silent. The manuscript begins by telling the reader that the emotional truths come from experiences passed through generations, and that the story should be read as a companion to history, where some of its silences have been filled in. That's The Blue Ridge Between Us, a novel, a family story, a Civil War story, a Blue Ridge Mountain story, and in more ways than I understood when I began writing it, a story about memory, about the people whose names survived, and about the mountains that remembered them. I'm Ryan Phillips, author of The Blue Ridge Between Us, and if you've read the book, I hope this episode gives you a different way of seeing the people inside it. Because Fidel Phillips was here, Josiah Sams was here, Hiram Phillips, Alan Buckner, William Murray, Joel Holcombe, they were all here. They walked these roads, knew these mountains, and generations later, their names remain. Maybe that's what an echo really is. Not a voice returning unchanged, but something carried forward, long after the person who first made the sound is gone. Until next time, listen carefully. The echoes are still here.